Hi, listeners. Stories have so much power, and so does whoever controls the narrative. It is time that we dissect and analyze these stories. I am Vipul, and this is WokeTales. This week's episode comes before the extended tax filing deadline, which is May 17, and I bring you a story from the Grimm's Fairy Tales, originally children's and household tales, published in 1857 in German and later translated in English. This is a story about social classes, generational wealth, and socio-economic inequality. But before that, I want to welcome our guest who will dissect and analyze the story with me. Hi, Kevin. Welcome to WokeTales.
Thanks for having me on.
Kevin is the host of the Sensible Socialist podcast, a podcast for the rational left. I hope you have your socialist lenses on for the story analysis, Kevin. And do you want to tell a little bit about your podcast?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I don't think I can ever take off my socialist glasses. But, I am a podcaster. I have the Sensible Socialist podcast. That's been going for a few years now, but essentially just a kind of small space on the online left for me, and I guess those of a similar kind, to be able to have a kind of open space for discussion without being worried about censorship or anything like that, just kind of trying to have all those conversations. And then I do also co-host the All Things Co-op podcast, which is presented by Democracy at Work, which really focuses on looking at like cooperatives from a sort of socialist Marxist angle and working on that. So there's sort of two podcasts that I'm doing. I also run a small YouTube channel that focuses on space documentaries, flying, and other drumming, other hobbies of mine. So
Wow.
That's some of the stuff that I do to occupy my time and create what I hope is interesting content.
Wow. Everyone, be sure to check out Kevin's podcast and YouTube channel. Also, suddenly my cat has been like, she's
I
so...
heard that it was cute.
I was like, suddenly she woke up from her nap and she's like, okay, what's going on?
Yeah. Who are you talking to?
Okay. All right. So there's a lot of content variety coming from you, from socialism to drumming to space.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty cool. Again, welcome on the show.
Sure.
And at this point, it's story time.
All right.
When Adam and Eve were driven from paradise, they were forced to build a house for themselves on barren ground and do all the work manually with physical labor. Adam hoed the field and Eve spun the wool. Every year, Eve delivered a child, but none of the children were like each other. Some were good-looking and some ugly. After a considerable time had gone by, God sent an angel to them to announce that he himself was coming to inspect their household. Eve cleaned the house diligently, decorated it with flowers, and spread rushes on the floor. She brought in her children, but only the good-looking ones. She washed and bathed them, combed their hair, put freshly laundered shirts on them, and cautioned them to be polite and well-behaved in the presence of the God. They were to bow down before him courteously, offer to shake hands, and answer his questions modestly and intelligently. The ugly children, however, were not to let themselves be seen. She hid one of them beneath the hay, another in the attic, the third in the straw, the fourth in the stove, fifth in the cellar, sixth under a tub, seventh beneath the wine barrel, the eighth under an old pelt, the ninth and 10th beneath the cloth from which she made her clothes, and 11th and 12th under the leather from which she cut their shoes. She had just finished when someone knocked at the front door. Adam looked through the crack and saw it was God. He opened the door reverently, and the Heavenly Father entered. There stood the good-looking children in a row. They bowed before him, offered to shake hands, and knelt down. God began to bless them. He laid his hands on the first, saying, "You shall be a powerful king." did the same thing to the second, saying, "You a prince," to the third, "You a count," to the fourth, "You a knight," to the fifth, "You a nobleman," to the sixth, "You a merchant," to the seventh, "You a scholar." Thus he bestowed his richest blessings upon them all. When Eve saw that the Lord was so mild and gracious, she thought, "I'll bring forth my ugly children as well. Perhaps he will bestow his blessings on them too." So she ran and fetched them from the hay, the straw, the stove, and wherever else they were hidden away. In they came, the whole coarse, dirty, scabby, sooty lot of them. God smiled, looked at them all, and said, "I will bless them as well." He laid his hands on the first and said to him, "You shall be a peasant." To the second, "You a fisherman." To the third, "You a smith." To the fourth, "You a tanner." To the fifth, "You a weaver." To the sixth, "You a shoemaker." To the seventh, "You a tailor." To the eighth, "You a potter." To the ninth, "You a teamster." To the 10th, "You a sailor." To the 11th, "You a messenger." To the 12th, "You a household servant," all the days of your life. When Eve had heard all this, she said, "Lord, how unequally you divide your blessings. All of them are my children, whom I have brought into the world. You should favor them all equally." But God replied, "Eve, do you not understand? It is right and necessary that the entire world should be served by your children. If they were all princes and lords, who would plant grain, thresh them, grind and bake it? Who would forge iron, weave cloth, build houses, plant crops, dig ditches, and cut out and sew clothing? Each shall stay in his own place, so that one shall support the other, and all shall be fed like parts of a body." Then Eve answered, "O Lord, forgive me. I spoke too quickly to you. Let your divine will be done with my children as well." Wow. So Kevin, what are your thoughts on the story?
So I think that like the first thing that comes to my mind is whenever, using a kind of Marxist lens, whenever you look at like something like this, a story like this, or sort of anything, you kind of want to put it in its context. And I think that this story is somewhat sets a context for itself, but it's interesting to me. I think when you look at Grimm's particularly, I think it was published in the 1850s, so this is after the revolutions of 1848. This is when you already have the sort of development of capitalism in Germany and in England and other places, and so it's hearkening back to obviously a sort of Christian motif where you have sort of Adam and Eve, the first human beings, and it's attempting to, through a kind of story, in some ways justify or a bit explain the kind of division of labor that was developing, that was a different kind of division of labor than there was sort of in the feudal era. And so it's very interesting to me how it shows the particular position of Germany in the 1850s in this kind of middle road between having some feudal arrangements but then this new like capitalist structure developing, of why there is these divisions and what ultimately sort of justifies it. And I think this is a kind of parable that would attempt to sort of put people in their place and to make it seem a little bit more sensible as to why there is this division of people in certain areas, and in many ways the sort of inequality between them. This adds a divine aspect to it, which is hard to argue with if you're so inclined. And I guess the only other thing that I thought of too is my wife is from India, and when we started getting together and stuff, I really didn't know much about India, and so learning about Hinduism and particularly like even the caste system, it's kind of interesting to me that this is reminiscent of that there is these kinds of like, here's your place, this is what you do, this is your place in society, and it is what it is. I mean, I think the most telling line, or the most impactful to me, is right towards the end: each shall stay in his own place. That there's a division of labor. Human beings are divided by what they do, and that is in some ways who they are, and that's never going to change. That this is the way that the world is, and there's nothing that we're going to be able to do about that. And I mean, this is coming obviously from God himself, but I think it's kind of trying to make sure that, I think in the context of a revolutionary shift that's kind of happening in the larger society in which this story was first published is a kind of potentially a warning, potentially a justification for the division of labor and inequality. And I think, you had Marx and Engels already at that time talking about a new system, a new socialist system in which we would do away with this kind of the division of labor that we are used to seeing in either slave societies or feudal societies or capitalist societies, in which there's these divisions among human beings between owners and workers, and workers doing different kinds of things, and instead proposing this idea that you would have a society where people would freely be able to associate their labor and kind of choose for themselves what it is that they would want to do. This flies in the face of that idea. This is no, each, they'll say, in his own place. You're a fisherman, you're a smith, you're a tanner, you're a weaver. This is divine imposition of a historically contingent human structure. And so it's kind of fascinating to me just sort of seeing it put in, especially in this like Adam and Eve sense. There's one part which is the division of labor amongst all of the children. And then there is this second one of only the good-looking children
right.
to get to have these positions. It does say something about the interrelationship between what it is people do, the value that they derive, not necessarily from what it is they're doing, because that almost seems in many ways not really freely chosen, but sort of forced in many ways. And then this added aspect of, I think we kind of all know that, and there's been like studies and stuff that have talked about this, where like pretty people have it easier, that pretty people tend to get advantages that the sort of rest of us don't have. And we have this idealization of a beauty that really reified by celebrity culture, and then now is having this second heyday with the influencer culture. And so it's an amazing thing to think that when this story was written, being something like a blacksmith, or maybe like a knight or a powerful king or a count, maybe what people were looking for and wanting to be. And I think now a lot of what you see is people wanting to be social media influencers for their job, and the sort of role, I think, that, especially because so little of social media is deep in terms of its intellectual or sort of written form, it's very much visual and hyper-focusing on looks of people. And so the story is interesting in the sense that it plays on both of these, I think, fundamentally problematic, but also very deeply entrenched notions that the system is what it is, and it's not going to change, and you better find your place in it and be happy. And that's going to be a lot easier if you're a good-looking person rather than the poor, not good-looking kids who get stuck in the attic or in the straw or in the stove.
Right. Yeah, so I think it's like a double whammy for someone who's poor and not conventionally good looking.
Right.
Probably like no hope for you.
Yep.
Also, I like how you analyzed it from a historical timeline point of view about feudalism and capitalism. And the story cleverly uses the divine angle to make the point stronger, because the stories, they can be so powerful because they go down from generation to generation and they have this message. So whoever initially writes the story, they probably have an agenda and they can control that narrative and they can pass it on from generation to generation, and people can pick on things, the different things can resonate with them. But there's definitely a big theme in this, like you said, where that everyone has their place in the society and then you just got to make your peace with it. However, obviously it was written in the olden times, but if I want to bring it to today's context, we hear that if you work hard or if you're smart, then you can be successful and have that economic prosperity. And then looking at people who are doing multiple jobs, working super hard, and telling them that, oh, your lack of hard work or your lack of smartness or intelligence is what's keeping you back is a big insult to them.
Yeah.
And their work, right?
It's a myth that is perpetuated, I think, in many ways to serve the interests of the already wealthy. Like that there's this, like, because of the vast inequality that wealth creation produces and the exploitation on which it actually generates, there is this need to have a justification for wealth that isn't, I'm stronger than you, or I have more power than you. And so there's this myth that gets created that it's really just because of one's ingenuity or intelligence or hard work or something like that. But I think what's interesting about bringing it back to the story is that in many ways, I think for a lot of people, it may not be as specific as like you will be a weaver or you will be, a potter or a teamster, but something like you shall be a peasant. I think that there are many of us who recognize that because of either the existence of or lack of kind of generational wealth, that our prospects were limited, that we had a certain kind of life that we could go for, and we could work really, really hard and still not get ahead. And we could try our best, and we could be really smart and really capable. But if we don't find ourselves with the opportunities to actually express that and to have that translate back into the things that we need to live what we might call a middle-class life, then we're stuck. And I think that it does feel like it's as if God himself came down and said, look, you're going to just be a worker. You're not really, there's again this myth of like the rags to riches story, the Bill Gates who like started in his garage and look at all this. It's like, well, that doesn't happen on its own, and it's usually because of a series of lucky happenstances that a person finds themselves in that position. But for the rest of us, it doesn't really matter. We are where we are. The biggest determinator of your ability to gain wealth in society is the wealth you were born into. Whether there was a lot of it or lack thereof. And I think that the grand irony with that myth of the hard work relating to wealth is that if you look at anyone who's got any kind of second or later generation wealth, those people tend to not work very hard. They still have a lot. They don't really work very hard. And so the irony is that sometimes the person picking your raspberries is probably working 5 times harder than the person who owns the company that sells the raspberries, but the person who owns the company who sells the raspberries makes all the money. And so it's a propaganda aspect of trying to justify a kind of generally recognized, unequal, unfair, unjustifiable system that forces us to create stories in order to pretend that the world is in some ways different than it really is.
Right, yeah. So we can say that lack of economic outcome is directly proportional to the lack of opportunities. Mm-hmm. And then someone who is already poor or doesn't have access to good education or college degree, they don't have that kind of opportunity to get a good job later or to work towards something. They don't have that kind of training. Mm-hmm. It's like a circle. And it's funny you mentioned Bill Gates. Not discounting how smart or how clever Bill Gates is, but he came from a very wealthy family, and his mother propelled him to this huge success he is today. She had worked with the IBM chairman and used her connection to get Bill Gates that deal with IBM, and Microsoft was born. So definitely he is very smart and clever, but he is definitely lucky too to be born in that family and to have those kind of connections, which helped him in being the success he is today. Also tying up the part of the good-looking kids. We see that in society, the celebrities or good-looking people according to societal standards. If they do something illegal, they get a lighter punishment, and people are likely to sympathize with them. Or if we look at everyday life, they get more of a benefit of doubt, like depending on how you look.
I think that it's interesting when we talk about something like privilege, which is obviously a word that we hear a lot in terms of, especially in the United States, comparing black and white in terms of white privilege and things like that. And not to dismiss the idea in terms of racially, I think that there is an aspect to that. But if we really look at who has privilege in our society, it is the pretty and the wealthy. And usually one or both of those transfers to power. And so you have a situation where the benefits in society accrue to people who basically through no work on their own, through luck at birth, who they were born to, either in terms of what genetics they got to create their face or what money was in their pocket the moment they were born, is what really determines the kind of privileges that one enjoys in society. And so if you look at even the story, as much as we might find problematic the idea that each child is given some kind of task, it's the powerful, it's the pretty ones who get to be the king and the prince and the count and the knight, and it's the ugly ones who get to be the peasant, the fisherman, the smith, the tanner. And so there is this recognition that, and I think even in this story, it's sort of to kind of try to placate the quote unquote less beautiful, which we might analogize to lucky, right? So that the lucky are going to be the king, the prince, the count, the knight, and then the unlucky are going to be the peasant, the fisherman, the smith. And so I think then even in the story, Eve protests and say, but they're all my children and you should favor them equally. But then there's this justification, well, we have to have a division of labor. Who's going to do all the work. Each should stay in their own place so that we can support each other. Again, this reminds me of Hinduism in the sense that you need all four groups in society to do what they need to do in order to have, it's almost like your arms, your legs, your head, and your neck. And so this is recognizing something that we all kind of know is true, that it's luck that gives you privilege. It isn't your deeds. And there's something I think we all, that Eve expresses in here, that it just pinches us in this equality nerve, that there's just somehow something unfair about the idea that it isn't meritocratic, where your merit is what determines your status in society, but it's all of these happenstances of birth, whether or not you were born pretty or born into a good family. And I think this maintains itself to this day. I mean, I think that if you're lucky enough to be born to people who are at least even able to maintain a kind of middle-class lifestyle, you're tending to go to better schools. When you're talking about the opportunity, we just live in a society that it's often been levied at us communists and socialists that what we want is that everyone is just paid the same, that we want equality of outcomes. And the grand irony of that is that that's not at all what it is that we're talking about. That what we're really talking about is trying to create a society that will give genuine access to opportunity, that will not base people's privilege on the happenstances of their birth, whether or not they're lucky to be pretty or rich, but instead provide a means by which nobody is arbitrarily rich such that they can pass that along generationally. And I think the beauty part will be difficult in some ways to totally eradicate, because I do think that people like to look at pretty things, and that includes people. But it would not bar the quote-unquote ugly person from attaining genuinely self-edifying and self-realizing opportunities in terms of like being able to do what it is that they want to do. And so a sort of socialist society would be one in which individuals collectively own their businesses in a way that doesn't allow a single individual to exploit them and take all the wealth, which allows them to participate, to be able to genuinely feel part of the process, and to be able to, if they're not liking where that business is going, to pull themselves out knowing that they're still going to have a house and food and all of these like basic necessities, so that they can apply themselves to something that feels more apt to them. That's a society that is not going to privilege luck of your birth in the same way that our current society does. And coming back to the story, it still allows us to be able to kind of have it both ways, in which we will not be divided between tanner, weaver, shoemaker, or prince, count, or knight, but instead all be smiths, tanners, and weavers, and all be prince, counts, and knights. And so I think that the story kind of easily justifies an unequal and unfair system. And I think that, there's just a part of me that thinks, one thing that we maybe not have done very well on the more radical left side of things is to create some of these cultural kinds of myths and stories that would attempt to justify the system that we want to bring in. I think these are very easy to understand and kind of quick piecemeal stories that do bring about larger truths. And there's a kind of lack of that, a lack of accessibility on the part of more radical people. Mm-hmm. And so it's kind of, in one sense, I read this and I'm just kind of like, what the hell is this? And then I, kind of take a step back and you go, a child can understand this. And a child might have difficulty understanding what it is that a communist means, especially in a place like the United States of America, where communist is essentially evil, and so it's really hard to disentangle. But I think having stories like this, very easy kind of to understand stories, would be very helpful. And the only one I can think of is I have a 14-month-old child, and every now and then we'll read from the Communism for Kids book, which I think is in some ways attempting to do something like this, but it isn't a Grimm's fairy tale, let's put it that way.
Right. Yeah, I think it's really important that whatever, especially kids are, because they are at a impressionable age, that subconsciously they might absorb some ideas or ideologies which can be harmful later. And this is like one story which has this theme, but there are so many other stories which have problematic themes, but we still tell our kids those fairy tales. And obviously, US is not ready for the equal society you were talking about, where everyone is everything. To give an example, and I don't know how you feel about Bernie Sanders, but when he talked about canceling student debt to create a level playing field, it received a lot of resistance. I think it was a great idea because, talking from a middle class perspective, someone who has a lot of student debt will start saving by the time they are 40, 50, compared to someone who doesn't have debt and starts accumulating at the age of 25. How can you catch up to that? And mostly it's the people who had the familial financial support who wouldn't have this debt. Also, I think people who aren't super rich and who did take loans but paid off their debt didn't like the idea very much, because it was more about, if we had to do it, others should have to do it as well. And that's because as a society, we compete with each other. We fight with each other and not with the system.
Yes, I think that in the United States in particular, we have adopted the part of our there was this famous Italian Marxist called Antonio Gramsci, and he came up with this idea of among many other ideas, of this idea of, it talked about cultural hegemony, the idea that there's a ruling class in society, and they're usually the people with the power and the wealth, and in our society that's going to be big business owners and wealthy people, and they will create a kind of what we would call quote unquote common sense, all of these kind of like things that go without saying. They're like, of course, that's just like, that's how things work, and like you're not going to be able to change it. And I think in some ways this story is sort of adding to that notion of like, what is common sense? Well, there's common sense that like some people, the pretty people and the well-off people, get to be powerful princes, kings, counts, and everyone else has to find their way in the world. And so these, in the course of the historical development and social development, get entrenched, and I think in the United States are entrenched in a way that is really pernicious and really difficult. It's something that's like making progress harder. And I think we did see that with Bernie Sanders, and as critical as I could be of Bernie Sanders in my view of not going far enough, I think what Bernie Sanders was promoting is exactly what we need at this period of time, is to kind of move the ball towards the goal, even if I want to get to the end zone. And so I think so you talk about student loans, it's like, why should someone get their student loans paid off when I had to pay for mine? There's a kind of understanding that you can have with that, right? There seems something inequitable about somebody getting a benefit when someone else didn't. At the same time, one has to understand that things in society are not fixed in some moment in time and then frozen there, that they move and they change. And I mean, I went to law school, and so I have like a couple $100,000 in student loan debt. Mm-hmm. And so for me, if it were not for income-based repayment programs and even during like COVID, the whole like not having to pay them, I would not be able to have purchased a house. You know, I would struggle to take care of my kid and struggle to do what is kind of basic human things like reproduce the next generation and try to keep a house over your head. And so that is, I think, a different kind of situation that a lot of people who did pay off their student loan debts were in. But I also think that it's this common sense notion in the United States serves the interests not of the large mass of people in society, the sort of general working class. It really only benefits the people at the top, because they're the ones who are creating this kind of ideology, and they're maintaining the hegemony, the intellectual hegemony in society and culture. You know, and so you're very rarely seeing a movie that is pro-socialist or something like that, right? Or even like pro-Russian or something like that, because that's so antithetical to the pervasive norms of our society that are created by, perpetuated by, and in the interests of those who already stand at the top of it. And so we have this massive situation in the United States of a false consciousness where you will hear, I don't know if you remember Joe the Plumber. I think that was from like maybe the 2016 election or even earlier than that. But he's this like just random plumber guy, like the typical working class Joe. I mean, his name was literally Joe and he was a plumber. Mm. And he was talking about how high taxes on business were going to hurt him and stuff like that. And it was just so far removed from the kind of actual reality that he lives in, because in the United States, most working class people adopt the ideology of an incredibly wealthy person, and they want like low taxes on business and stuff like that because they think it's in their interest when it really isn't. And I think the government is essentially set up in the same way, that where it's supposedly representing the mass of society, but in practice only does things for the interests of the already entrenched wealthy and powerful. And so I think the United States is this very interesting place where it seems relatively obvious how unhelpful this dynamic is, but it is nevertheless pervasive and so commonplace that the moment you tell somebody, hey, you know, I'm a Marxist or I'm a communist, it's as if you told them that your hair was on fire, you know, or something like that. It's just so far away from quote unquote common sense that the answer is just like, how could you possibly be that way? And so I think it's a very difficult situation. And so you have these like really good commonplace in other places in the world of like social democratic ideas like Medicare for all, or canceling student loan debt, or making college free. And instead, you end up having to fight against this idea that somehow that's like not fair for the people who already had the benefits, that policies shouldn't be made for the worst off in our society. And we forget and push to the sidelines and marginalize the losers in our society to the point where they are, I mean, you think about something like Skid Row or other places where you just have this like area in which we just shove all of the people who we don't want to see out, and we make park benches that you can't lay on, and we do all of these kinds of like criminalizing poverty and homelessness and all these kinds of things in order to push the consequences of our system out of our mind. And going back to the story, I mean, I think it's like what Eve does in this story is to try to like, oh, let's keep the kind of ugly kids, the out of the way, because we're like embarrassed by that. Now we kind of know it exists, but if we keep them hidden, maybe we won't have to realize that there's something wrong with what it is that we're doing. And I guess in some ways, to God's credit in this story, he decides he's going to bless the children too, but he blesses them by forcing them to be the subservience of those who are pretty. And so one good deed, as we might see in many kind of liberal, you know, like a soup kitchen is a great thing, but a soup kitchen is doing nothing to fundamentally address why there is the need for a soup kitchen. Mm-hmm. And so I think that we can always look to things that seem like good things in the moment, but can also and should also be critical of them for simply not going far enough. And I think maybe just to bring it back to Bernie Sanders, that's my very quick and brief critique of Bernie Sanders, is that everything Bernie Sanders proposes is good, it will benefit people, will move America closer to a place that people, I think, would generally want to live and would see thrive, but that it will fundamentally not address the underlying problems of a system that is based on exploitation and produces massive amounts of inequality. At the same time, it's one step at a time. You got people for whom these ideas are so difficult to understand, and for which, you know, the ideas in this story are so deeply held that to suggest that there is something wrong with God's position in this story of, while simultaneously realizing that, say, all human beings have value or maybe rights, that there's this human beings are endowed in this sense literally by their creator with certain unalienable rights. Those are not necessarily life, liberty, and happiness, but those are to be a fisherman, a smith, a tanner, a weaver, a shoemaker, a tailor, a potter, a teamster, a sailor, a messenger, and a servant. I think that is in many ways how we should look at even some of the things that we want to see and that we're in favor of, because we can recognize that most things are a double-edged sword. And I think coming out of the kind of Marxist position, the notion of the dialectic, that like everything that we can think of has a contradiction built in within it, or has some kind of thing that isn't good. Even the best ideas, there's some poison pill inside of it. And that if we maintain a perspective that knows that contradiction is there, and to figure out what we can do with the contradiction, maybe then we can actually move forward and get somewhere that we want to do. But if we pretend that, I think like it says in this story, you know, each still stay in his place and that's the way that it is, then progress is going to be very difficult indeed.
Right. And also, we see that the wealth gap is getting bigger and bigger, and so many of the societal problems and issues can be solved by the wealth which is being hoarded. And going back to what you said about homeless people and Eve trying to hide the ugly kids, recently there were some very insensitive comments made by Caitlyn Jenner about homeless people. And I want to add that if your problem with homeless people is that you are seeing them on streets, if you are being subjected to that spectacle and not that they're homeless, then I don't think politics and public service is for you. So before I ask you, like, what do you think can we do? I just want to make one point, just because it was bothering me so much, was that
Mm-hmm.
I never see like a story where Adam has done anything wrong. They always put they always put something on the Eve, and I just
Yeah.
the feminist in me is always disappointed and angry that not only Eve has these vices, but even God promotes this patriarchal setup by making her subservient to Adam, and probably having a profound negative impact on women throughout history and stories and folk tales. Anyway, so I guess we can come back to the the story of the socialism point of view. So what do you think, like, you or me, someone who doesn't have that kind of power, can do to lean the system in that direction?
So the sort of canned response in some way is, I think it's in the Communist Manifesto. It's somewhere in Marx where he says that capitalism produces its own gravediggers, in the sense that it creates an organized working class. Because the organized working class is what's actually running society and has all of the knowledge and capability that's necessary to kind of keep production going and to actually increase it and to hopefully get us to a place where we would be sort of post-scarcity and be able to provide for everybody. So it's in joining up with fellow working people, with your coworkers, with your neighbors, with just the everyday person in, I think, a united struggle. I think that it's interesting, the process of the contradictions that are built in capitalism kind of force this upon people who aren't necessarily like already radical people. It radicalizes people constantly because we can easily see where it fails. And so one of the problems I think that there was in 19th and 20th century versions of quote-unquote communism was this focus on power. Who's holding the power? How do they hold the power? And in what institutions? And many times this was like the state apparatus, that that there was going to be this organization, usually the Communist Party, that was going to take the reins of this other organization, the state, and use the power that exists in the state as it exists right now and sort of force in a new system that would be a better one. I think that there are a lot of problems with that because it maintains that same focus on like individual power and does tend to create cults of personality and all kinds of organizational and social negative consequences. And so I think that what we really all need to do is to recognize that there is power in even small organizations of individuals, that we can't do anything on our own, that despite the pervasive ideology, particularly in the United States, of like rugged individualism and this like, I'm just going to do it on my own. Everybody needs help. Everybody needs support. Everybody needs a group of people that they can rely on. And I think sometimes we restrict ourselves too much to just having that be our family or our close group of friends. And we really need to extend it into organizations of our fellow workers. Because I think that what we are at the end of the day is what we do. And what we do is work. And we work in these collective organizations, these businesses, in order to do something that has value. And the only way that we're ever going to confront the power that is created through the extraction of the surplus value that we all collectively create is to come together to be able to face that entrenched, already existing power. So it's joining organizations that might be some kind of employee organization, even if that's just like, going running or a softball league or something like that with your coworkers. It could be as big as the Democratic Socialists of America and trying to organize, a large political party for the purposes of trying to actually get into power and legislate some important moves in the right direction. It may be a union at work that's able to kind of confront the boss and to try to, work in the interests of all of the workers. But it's always going to be in the form of some kind of organization. You'll never be able to, another myth of sort of David and Goliath is this idea that like a small individual can, I think by the grace of God and maybe a little luck, beat a giant. That isn't how the world tends to work. It is only a group of people who can genuinely confront individuals with power that far exceeds any kind of justification. And so it is only together that we can win and that we can prevail. And so I think a lot of us feel, especially during COVID, very disconnected from each other and very much atomized in our own houses and just kind of doing our own things. And so I think there's going to be, as much as people talk about a kind of explosion in the economy, there's just going to be like, a lot of growth and stuff like that. I think what we're actually going to see is a lot of growth in organizations that may not be traditionally kind of working class oriented organizations like a communist party or something like that, but will end up being that way because we will be so desperate to come together to do kind of anything that in doing so, we're going to be able to see the power that there are in these institutions and hopefully start to wield them, which is, I think, one of the reasons why there wasn't as much success in Bernie's campaign as there probably could have been. Despite having a large organization that was, well-staffed, it was coming up against an organization with that much more power. With that much more power demands that much more people, and we need to meet huge amounts of power held by a small amount of people with a huge amount of people. And I think that's really the only way that we're ever going to really see a society that's truly worth living in and what I would say is truly human.
Yeah. Think about which society you want to live in and how you can be part of that organized force Kevin just mentioned.
Yeah.
Also, I love the quote about capitalism producing its own gravediggers. And I want to thank you, Kevin, for your thoughtful analysis, knowledge. You brought in great insight and expertise to the story in analyzing it. So thank you for that.
For sure, yeah, and I just want to mention too. I think you pointed out something very key with the difference between Adam and Eve always getting the sort of short end of the stick and being the responsible one. I am certain that as you go through different stories, that will be a quite common theme. So,
right.
So,
yes.
Absolutely. Like, I think it's something that I think only until very recently have we really genuinely recognized how deep and pervasive these notions of what we might shorthand as patriarchy, but just the sort of the domination of male-centered views and how often and how badly women in stories are either represented or treated or positioned, and how that absolutely reflects to how, for the vast majority of the existence of, I would say, class society, so not necessarily human society. I don't think that patriarchy is necessarily a human thing. I think it's a thing that develops out of classes. Once you have an agricultural revolution that forces what we kind of see even in this story, the fisherman, the smith, the tanner, the weaver, only when you get these divisions of society based on class do you also create these pervasive and pernicious notions of divisions of people among gender or geographical location or population or race or something like that. I think it was Aristotle who said that you never get philosophy unless somebody else is making the bread. And I think that you're not going to get stories unless somebody else is making the bread. And by the time you get somebody making the bread, you've already created a class society. And so every story that we hear and every fairy tale and parable and all those kind of things, I think are going to be imbued with a kind of significantly problematic relationship primarily between men and women, but I also think between children and parents and between people of different either cities or geographical locations, because the division of society into the haves and the have-nots make it much easier to divide society based on other things that are not legitimate grounds for division, but are basically aided by the fact that built like as a foundation in society, you have a division between who does work and who benefits from the work of other people. And so as a kind of, for me, the last sort of thing, just the goal of Marxists and communists is to actually end that period of history of humanity and to go in some ways kind of back to a system in which is not fundamentally divided on this haves and have-nots, but on genuinely a sort of free and equal notion. And it's only when we're going to get into that kind of, it's only in that society will we be able to shed the long and soiled skin of our patriarchy and racism and xenophobia and homophobia and all of these other kinds of really terrible, long-lasting cultural phenomenon that exist because it significantly helps maintain and in some ways obscure the fundamental division in society, which isn't really necessarily between men and women or children and parents or black and white or gay or straight. It's between people who have wealth and power and people whose labor is exploited to create that. And so I think that that may be a decent parting thought for me, but I do think that it is my view that changing away from a class-based society is going to be the necessary, although not sufficient, condition for ending some of these other terrible divisions in our society. So it isn't as if getting rid of classes will immediately end racism or sexism or something like that, but it's only until we are able to economically divulge ourselves of this horrific division between the haves and have-nots, then we're ever going to be able to address the other things that are in some ways more visceral, but floors on top of a foundation that is already rotten and in well need of refurbishing.
Right, yeah. So on a parting note, take-home message can be whatever you hear or read, keep dissecting and analyzing to make a well-informed opinion.
Mm-hmm.
So
they're all coming from somewhere, and they're all trying to say something. So you should always ask yourself, what are they really trying to say, and from where does this come? Because I think if you look at those two things, stories that may seem just fine turn out to be horrible.
Right. Yeah, like who is holding the narrative, right? And then what's
Exactly.
their agenda? So keep questioning that and coming up with a rational answer.
Yep.
So on that note, Kevin, are you on any social media for you yourself or your projects which you want to plug in here?
Yes, I recently went to doing actual videos instead of just audio on the Sensible Socialist podcast, so you can find that on YouTube. Just look up Sensible Socialist. Twitter handle is Sensible Social 1 for the Sensible Socialist, and then the All Things Co-op podcast, you can go to democracyatwork.info/ATC, and those will be all the episodes. It's also on the Democracy at Work YouTube channel and Democracy at Work social media handles and all that kind of stuff. It'll be generally at Democracy at Work. And if you want to, you can look up Kevin Gustafson on YouTube, which is where you'll find the space and the drumming and the flying. And you can check me out personally. It's Kevin Gustafson on Instagram, and posting stuff there too. So check that out.
Great. Thank you, Kevin. And on that note, don't forget to file your taxes, which is deadline is in few days. And also, I just want to add that push your government to tax the rich.
That's right. Absolutely.
On that note, bye for now.
Thanks a lot.
Let me know your thoughts on the story and our discussion by emailing me on WokeTalesPodcast.com or through social media at WokeTalesPodcast on Instagram and WokeTalesPod on Twitter. And please rate, review, and like WokeTales podcast, and don't forget to subscribe so you can easily access our weekly stories. If you have any story recommendations, or if you want to come dissect and analyze a story with me, give me a shout out on email or social media, because whatever you do, keep dissecting and keep analyzing.